Okay, good morning. Good Pesach Sheni. Welcome back to Dan, who, while we were learning about Kibbutz Avayim, he was practicing it. It's called Untitled Chapter Matzah. Don't worry, you haven't missed out. We will continue to be addressing the theme of Kibbutz Avayim over the next few months. So first of all, the history of the Matzah. Well, the history of the Matzah is that I got this box last year before Pesach, and I used it as the Eruv in my building, the Eruv Chatzeres, which was just replaced with a new box of Matzah, and therefore it may be a little bit stale. Hopefully when I bought it, it was actually from last year's a bakery, and it's not more than a year or so old. That's the history of the Matzah, and goodbye. No, just kidding. Okay. So, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Matzah in its various forms. There was some talk this morning about the Taimani Matzahs, the thick Matzahs, and I'm actually also, as one of my hobbies is to dispel myths, I'm actually going to dispel what I believe to be a little bit of a myth. Not drastically, but a little bit of a myth. But anyway, let's start. So, of course, the Torah says that on Pesach we have to have matzah, bread that is not chametz, that is not leavened. There isn't really much detail in Torah B'chsav as to what constitutes chametz, at what stage in the process of the leavening does it become chametz. And throughout the history of our people, what exactly people used, what type of bread was used for matzah, has changed and developed over the years, and it becomes very difficult to sort of get a clear reading of the history because there isn't really such a very clear recorded history. And in recent years, there has become an effort among scholars to try and sort of write a clear map of the history, and they're really combing through vast literature of tshuvos, of poskim, where they make various references to matzah and the process of preparing matzah, and based on that, trying to map out the history in over both historically and geographically. In other words, at what places and in what times in history did which changes and developments happen in the matzah baking procedure. So let's start from, I'm not an expert in this subject, but I have read some of the material that's been published in recent years, and what follows is more or less a summary of that. So, the Gemara says that it brings a machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel as to whether or not one may bake thick bread on Pesach. Beis Shammai says no thick bread, and Beis Hillel says we can have thick bread. Beis Hillel say. So, as you I'm sure are familiar with, whenever there's a machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, we paskin like Beis Hillel, and the halacha remains, according to this brisa, according to this recording of the machlokes, that one may bake thick bread on Pesach. Now, how thick is thick? So Rav Huna in the Gemara says that thick bread means a tefach. A tefach. How much is a tefach? Like this? A tefach is 8 centimeters. What's that in inches?
10 centimeters.
8 centimeters.
8. A regular loaf of bread.
Yeah, 2 or 3 inches. How many inches is 8 centimeters?
A centimeter is 2.5 inches. 2.5 centimeters to the inch.
Right. So
10 centimeters is 4 inches.
So it's less than 4. It's 3 inches. Yeah, just a little over 3 inches.
It's still unleavened.
So Beis Shammai says you're not allowed to bake bread that is a tefach, Beis Hillel say you are. But actually, la halacha, even though we, in theory, paskin like Beis Hillel, we don't actually, because as the Gemara continues, that one may, Beis Hillel only opine that one may bake bread that's a tefach thick, or more than a tefach thick, when we meet certain criteria. So it has to be done quickly and in the right temperature, and etc., etc. And in order to avoid all the possible criteria, we refrain and we make sure that all our Pesach breads are less than a tefach thick. So no, all your breads on Pesach must be less than approximately 3.5 inches. So what emerges so far is...
Even the box that came in was less than a tefach.
Right, so the bread that we're talking about, even on the stringent side, that it's less than a tefach, you're talking about 10 or 15 times the thickness of the matzah that we're using. Now, in order to make such matzah, by the way, the sandwich that we have in the Seder night is called koirech. Now, as our Hebrew expert will tell you, the word koirech means a wrap, right? Like today, when you go to a restaurant, you order a wrap, because you wrap it around, right? When you wrap your tefillin around your arm, it's called koirech sheva kriches, right? The bread that was a tefach thick was obviously soft bread, which is basically accomplished by having the water flour ratio, having a lot more water than flour, makes a softer dough, and therefore that's how we have a thing. Obviously, if it would be the texture of our matzah times 15, it would be impossible to eat. So clearly, that was not the case. So that's what the Gemara records. Now later on, much later on in history, according to this article over here, the first explicit mention of matzahs being a lot less than a tefach is in the Sefer near there called Beis Hillel, which was printed in the year Taf Nun Aleph, which, as Shmuel Goodman will tell you, corresponds to 1691. So in 1691, that's 1789, yeah, that's 350 years ago. He mentions in passing that the matzahs that they had in his day were only the thickness of an etzbah. An etzbah is a quarter of a tefach. So
yeah, 1 finger.
So about an inch, maybe a little bit less than an inch, right? So still remarkably thicker than these matzahs here today. Now, why did they suddenly reduce the size of matzahs? Why? And the Gemara says we're less than a tefach, so let's call it 3 inches. So why by the time we got to the 17th century, or the beginning of the 18th century, why were we suddenly reducing the size of matzahs from 3 inches to 1 inch?
They were into weight gain, weight loss.
So one is, it could have been a chumrah because the Gemara just says less than a tefach, but it doesn't say how much less than a tefach. And so there could have been a chumrah that we want to make sure that all the dough, even on the inside of the matzah, is properly baked. And by the way, this is way before any chumras of baking matzahs in 18 minutes. There was no such thing in those days, and time permitting, we'll get there soon. But still, so they could have spent a lot of time on the matzah, but nevertheless, there was an idea to make it thinner so that to be more certain of that everything is properly baked. Yes?
But is that if you bake it thicker, then they spoil, or they get...
Hold on.
They get moldy.
Okay, now again, we don't have any recipe books from those days, and we don't know the exact ratio of flour and water that were used in these matzahs that were 1 inch thick, which pretty much is probably similar enough to the matzahs that our friend Rabbi Rabin had, the Taimani matzahs. But it's reasonable to assume that the reason why they I mean, even though they made them, why did, okay, so we're making them thinner than a tavach. Why were they not making them cracker like this? Because they wanted it to taste like bread, right? So if you have it like thick, like a pita, like 1 inch by 1 inch, it's still going to taste more or less like bread, right? I mean, in our minds, we associate matzah with cracker. But that's because nowadays that's what matzah is. But historically, matzah just has to be unleavened bread. There's no reason why it shouldn't be this. It'll be a bit less fluffy than this. But that's really what it is. Now, so clearly, hold on.
Pita all year round. So what was the difference?
The different.
Supervised.
Well, first of all, it was supervised. There was no yeast. Okay, Pita may not have any yeast, but okay. So now the problem. Of course, these matzahs, by the way, were also made with a much more watery dough than these are. Also, to be able to make it thick, and it should still be soft like bread. Now, the problem with these matzahs was what Akiva was alluding to. There's even been some cream cheese added over here. So there was the problem was that they would not stay fresh. And therefore, they had to be baked basically every day. You know, we would bake them that day on Pesach. You're allowed to. I mean, besides on Shabbos, on Pesach, Yom Tov, you're allowed to bake, and they would have to bake matzahs every day. They would bake matzahs
every day on Pesach?
Every day or every other day. You know exactly how long. I don't know exactly how long it stays fresh, but it was impossible in such a way, l'chayra, to have normal matzahs.
It's going to become chametz or.
Once it's baked, it doesn't become chametz.
Yeah, but what if in the process?
So what about in the process? So, in Shulchan Aruch it talks about how to bake matzahs on Pesach. In fact, till today, if I recall correctly, there is a custom which many Chassidim do, and the Rabbeim also used to do this, is to bake matzah on Erev Pesach. Now the matzah that you eat on the Seder night should be matzahs that were baked on the afternoon of Erev Pesach, which is already in the time when chametz is forbidden.
Chaim Tversky used to come to the bakery here and do that.
I didn't even know there was a matzah bakery in Chicago.
I did it. I designed it.
Still exists?
No, it only lasted for 3 or 4 years.
Yankee Turner and his
Sadov.
partner, Sadov, Jerry Sadov.
No, there's another guy too.
Anyway,
1 year or a couple of years?
so what do you do? What do you do when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos?
That's a problem.
You do it before. So it's mentioned such a shit in Shulchan Aruch, and I believe Skver Chassidim do this. That they bake the in such a year they bake the matzahs on Matzah Shabbos on the Seder night before they go home from Ma'ariv. They bake matzahs, and then they take it home. So yes. So what do you do with the chametz? So there is, when it comes to chametz, one of the ways of disposing of chametz is called bittul. That you declare it ownerless. Now, we don't rely on declaring chametz ownerless because we are concerned that you may not be sincere. If I take this bagel and I say I declare this to be as ownerless and meaningless as the dust on the earth, well, actually this bagel is worth more to me than the dust under my shoe. So therefore we make sure that you actually burn the chametz or sell it to a guy or actually do a legal thing. But when it comes to crumbs and leftover thing, there's no concern that you won't be sincere, and therefore you can be mevatel crumbs. The problem is that you can't be mevatel chametz on Pesach, because once the chametz is yours and you violated the mitzvah of owning chametz, now bittul wouldn't help anymore. But that's only if it's chametz. If it's not yet chametz, so then you could be mevatel it, and then it becomes chametz in its ownerless state. So when you bake matzahs on Erev Pesach in the afternoon, or on Pesach for that matter, it says in Shulchan Aruch, you should, every few minutes or every so often, you say Hapirurim Yeyu Hefker, that all the crumbs, which are not yet chametz, because it hasn't yet been the 18 minutes or whatever it is, are declared ownerless, and then there's no problem if it becomes chametz, because it's not yours. Nevertheless, it wasn't very ideal, because we're not talking here about everyone going to the matzah bakery, and people were doing this in their homes, right? They were baking matzahs in their home. Again, you had an oven at home, whatever type of oven you had. They didn't need these big commercial matzah ovens and things that could bake matzahs, and they weren't worried about baking matzahs in 18 minutes. And we'll see soon how the process, the timing of the process took. But people just bake matzahs every day at home. It wasn't very convenient. You had chametz around the house. It wasn't very convenient. It was doable, but it was not convenient. So therefore, over the course of time, a new minhag developed. And this minhag was to make the dough much less watery, to make a much thicker bread. This way, they were able to bake all the matzah they needed before Pesach, and it wouldn't spoil. Right? So they had solved the problem of having chametz around the house on Pesach. But with the salvation of that problem, we gave birth to a new problem. We gave birth to the problem of the matzahs hardly being edible. They were very hard, and this became
Dental issues.
Broke your teeth, right?
and it became very difficult to eat matzah, especially for young children and for older people or sick people. You really need to be able to, bite into it.
What about the type?
Now, the problem also becomes, though, that because there's less water in the dough, it becomes even more difficult to ensure that every speck of flour is actually properly kneaded into the dough. So we now have given birth to the first time in history where there was a problem of what we call gebroks. Because suddenly they were using a texture dough which had a lot less water in. It became difficult to ensure that all the flour was incorporated into the dough. And therefore there was a shaila about allowing the matzah to come in contact with water. At the same time, people had to have the matzah come in contact with water because it was very hard and it was difficult to eat if it was just dry. You wanted to make it soft, and you dipped it in your soup or you put something on it to seep into it to soften it up, and then that would make it easier to eat. So that's that stage in history is when for the first time we find the problem of gebroks emerging in the discussion in the poskim. The reason why before then there's no discussion of gebroks is because until then they were using a regular dough which was soft and had a lot of water in it, and there was no reasonable concern that there would be any flour which didn't make it into the dough.
What was the terminology for gebroks?
Matzah shruya.
So what's
Now-
the origin of matzah shruya becomes the shash of chametz like immediately and not within a certain amount of time? Why is it not eat immediately something without waiting the 18 minutes that it would take normally according to...
And a chanami, strictly speaking, there probably wouldn't be a chashash. It could be that there's l'chayra, you're right. L'chayra, strictly speaking, if you would get it wet and eat it right away, assuming that it's just flour which is dry, then there would be no chashash. There's actually another discussion because the Alter Rebbe, we're going to get later, the Alter Rebbe is not talking about the same type of matzah. The Alter Rebbe is later on in the development of matzah. But where we are right now, are we worried about the matzah, the flour being on the surface of the matzah or inside the matzah? Because l'chayra, if flour is on the surface of the matzah, it would be roasted in the oven. So even if it's not baked, it's roasted, and it would be it could no longer susceptible to becoming chametz. But the Alter Rebbe doesn't say that. The Alter Rebbe is concerned about the matzah, the flour on the surface of the matzah. Not just, other poskim talk about the flour within. That there would be it would be on the surface, and then you would do it one last, roll or whatever, and put it in the oven. But the Alter Rebbe does talk about the matzah, the flour on the surface. So, anyway, now here's where we come to the myth, which I wanted to dispel.
What year does concern arise with the wouldn't be edible or the chashash of the gebroks? What year?
The quote I'm about to tell you is from the Chacham Tzvi, who was born in the year Tov Chof, which is 360 years ago, almost, right? So he was born 360 years ago, and he passed away exactly 300 years ago, Tov Ayin Ches. So he lived for 60 years, and no, not even 60 years. It's 58 years. Yeah? And he now the Chacham Tzvi writes like this: because of such a far-fetched chashash, it is wrong to withhold simchas yom tov. Sorry, this is actually the Rabbi Yaakov Emden writing in the name of his father, the Chacham Tzvi. And he writes, he writes that my father, Chacham Tzvi, was very against all these people being machmir about the Matzah Shruya, about the gebroks, because it was a steer to Simchas Yom Tov. Now, here's where I come to the myth, because before I continue in the development of Matzah, this Chacham Tzvi is often flaunched, is that the word? By those who are against the Chumrah of gebroks. And they say, what do you mean? Simchas Yom Tov, how could you refrain from eating kneidlach? The Chacham Tzvi writes that there's a mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov, and this Chumrah is actually it's a hindrance to the biblical mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov. Now, the Alter Rebbe writes that Simchas Yom Tov does play a role in the Chumrah of gebroks, in that one may be mekel, one may be lenient about it on the last day of Yom Tov. Mekel mishum Yom Tov acher mishum Simchas Yom Tov lo yifsid. It's tolerable to be mekel and have gebroks on the last day of Yom Tov. And as I'm sure you're familiar, there's the sichos of the Rabbeim, who actually to explain how our minhag is not just our minhag is actually to specifically be mekel on the last day of Yom Tov. But the Alter Rebbe never said that it is an actual hindrance to Simchas Yom Tov not to have shruya. Hold on. And the Alter Rebbe never said such a thing. And what I'm trying, my point over here is that the Chacham Tzvi never said such a thing either. Because the Chacham Tzvi wasn't saying that if you don't have kneidlach, that's ruining Simchas Yom Tov. You might be nice to have kneidlach, but nobody is suffering on Yom Tov without kneidlach. What the Chacham Tzvi was talking about was this inch-thick matzah that was baked before Pesach, that was very, very difficult to eat. And in the words of later on in the Tshuva, he writes, they didn't want to have, they weren't able to eat very dry matzah, specifically for somebody for whom it's difficult to chew, right? The people who are saying, I'm not here to impose and say that everybody has to have the Chumrah of gebroks, but to use this Chacham Tzvi as an argument against the Chumrah of gebroks is historically not true. That's not what the Chacham Tzvi was talking about. The Chacham Tzvi wasn't talking about people who were not having kneidlach. He was talking about people who couldn't eat on Pesach. Right? Okay. Let's move on.
Just to agree with what you just said.
Yeah.
Simchas Yom Tov is the basar yain.
Yeah, so Simchas Torah is basar v'yayin, but Simchas Yom Tov isn't limited to basar and yayin. Anything that a person does, in fact, even basar nowadays, the halacha, there's no obligation to have basar. It's still a fulfillment of the mitzvah, but it's not an obligation to have meat.
Talking about matzah this thick and it's difficult to eat. You have the mitzvah on the first night to eat kazai, so it's impossible.
On the first night, it wasn't so bad because it was still fresh.
But that's not Simchas Yom Tov. That's more tsar.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. The Chacham Tzvi was saying that doing this chumrah is causing you tsar. Right? Now, now I have a bit of a klotz kasher because. Okay, let's move on and I'll get to the thing. Now, then there was the next development in the history of matzah was that they decided that what we're going to do is we're not changing out the recipe yet, but we're going to change the process of preparing the matzah. We're going to make them the bakery workers or whatever spend a lot of time on kneading the dough very well and rolling it out properly and make sure that there's no flour left. Right? Again, there's no 18 minutes, there's no 20, they could have spent a long time preparing the dough. And it was, in other words, so they said, instead of rushing to bake the matzahs, let's bake the matzahs slower and make sure we knead the dough properly and we roll it out properly and there's no flour left, and then the matzah will be thick and it'll get hard after the first few days.
And we'll have time to rise them.
But hold on, it's going to. But like this, there won't be any reason to be machmir for gebroks, because we'll make sure that there's actually no flour left.
Which is kind of what
The clock is ticking once the flour hits
They
the
do
water.
that these days
They
also.
didn't have the issue with
the thin
I'm going to explain. Nowadays, it is axiomatic to everyone that matzah has to be baked in 18 minutes. I'm going to explain coming up. I'm going to explain why that's not necessarily true. It is true today in practice, but halachically, it's not a requirement, and I'll explain to you soon why. But so that was the next stage, and that sort of solved the problem of shruya. Everyone continued having their wet matzah, and nobody had any problem with it because there was no flour left on the dough. Now, it took time to figure this out because it's expensive. You have to pay for labor. You have to have the facility and the time to do it, etc., etc. You're not talking about a commercialized world like we have today. This was every little shtetl figuring out how to make its matzah. Exactly. But, it's doable, and this minhag of making sure that you take a lot of time in kneading and preparing the dough spread. Okay. Then, actually, the next stage in the game was that they started doing things very quick. Now, in order to they started doing it very quick. They went back to doing everything very quick. I don't think we're talking yet about 18 minutes, but they went to doing things quick, so as to avoid any chashas of chametz. And in order to avoid the problem of the dough becoming not edible, they made it thin. They made cracker matzah. So they said instead of making more time and be making
more than halacha.
No, there was a chumrah to do it quick.
No, but the fact that it became thin, it was
in order to facilitate the chumrah. Yes, but it was in order to facilitate the chumrah of doing it fast. In order to do it fast, they had to start making very thin matzahs. And once you make thin matzahs, it becomes cracker matzahs.
I think so, yeah.
I should mention, it doesn't even talk about this in this article, but there's other problems with thin matzahs, because for Sfardim especially, it becomes a problem of whether or not to make hamotzi on it. We make hamotzi on matzah year round, but the Arshittus of Shulchan Aruch, that cracker is year round. So it sort of opened a new can of worms, but we're not getting in there.
Well, that was always there because they won't eat challahs with egg.
Yes.
They only eat water challahs.
Okay.
So that's a problem. It's always existed.
Can of sardines, worms are not coated.
So, never get away with opening cans in front of Shlomo Gorevich.
My conclusion of this whole thing is keep Rabbanim out of the kitchen.
Yeah, I agree with that one.
I think you should keep men out of the kitchen. Yeah. Anyway. So here, but the problem is that because they reverted now back to making things very quickly, the problem of flour, of raw flour, resurfaced. No pun intended, right? So because they had dealt with the problem of shruya by taking a long time over the thing. Now the problem resurfaced, but in a different form than it was before. Before, the problem of flour was they were having very thick matzah with some flour somewhere not baked. Now we're talking about cracker matzah with perhaps flour on it, because it's baked quickly, and it's baked with a dough which doesn't have a lot of water, and therefore there's reason to be concerned that perhaps some flour will be left on it.
Some pockets of flour.
And therefore therefore there's no problem. There's no problem. Sorry, therefore the problem of shruya reverts, but the shitta of the Chacham Tzvi is now irrelevant, because there's no mania of Simchas Yom Tov. Yeah, okay, it's nice to have knedlach, but there's no difficulty imposed on the masses by having cracker matzahs, right? Now, because this is the case, so for example, over here the Alter Rebbe writes, I think this is a quote from the Alter Rebbe. Yeah, this is actually a quote from a tshuva, not from Shulchan Aruch. This is from a response written by the Alter Rebbe. This is the famous tshuva of the Alter Rebbe, wherein he says that you could be lenient on Achron Shal Pesach. And he says, many matzahs that we can see with our own eyes that there is flour on them after they have been baked. This is a result of the fact that the dough was hard or thick, because, in other words, that it's a dough with not a lot of water, and it hasn't been kneaded well. If, as I am arguing, says the Alter Rebbe, that wet matzah is problematic, why wasn't it mentioned by the earlier authorities? Because the concern only exists in a thick dough which has not been kneaded very well. Over in the earlier generations, they would spend a lot of time both in the kneading and in the gilgul. How do you say that in English? In the rolling of the dough. And it's only in the last 20 years or a little bit more the holy Jews, Yisrael Kadoshim, have accepted, has become widespread, this custom, this carefulness to be very, very rushed in the kneading of the dough. Because of that, we don't knead it very well. And therefore, says the Alter Rebbe, there is flour on the matzahs nowadays, as is obvious to anybody who looks. Right? So it's obvious to anybody who looks that there is flour on the dough. Now, here, before I continue, I want to interject with my own sort of klotz kasha, which I don't have an answer. I don't think nothing can change, because change doesn't happen by my klotz kasha. But l'chayra, all of these chumras of baking the matzah quick, etc., have also brought us to a kula. The kula is that we're having matzah with flour on it. Right? Now, even though there is the concern that the flour will become chametz is very far-fetched, but the concern remains nonetheless. Why don't we nowadays go back to the old way of having thick matzahs, and the problem that it wasn't edible won't exist anymore because we have freezers, which is basically what the Teimanim do today, right? Yosef Rabin had that matzah, some of us tasted it, after Pesach. It remains very fresh and soft like a pita. Why? Because he just took it out of the freezer. And he said clearly, you take it out of the freezer and the next day it's in the garbage. You have to keep it in the freezer for it to work. But nowadays that we have that option, l'chayra, it would make a lot of sense to go back to that way of doing things.
And is a Yontiv tradition. So.
Exactly, yeah. So nothing's changing, but at least in theory, I think there's room for such an argument. Anyway.
Problem with the moisture?
Sorry?
Freezer has.
But but what I'm saying is that once you have that matzah, there's no problem of gebroks. Because it's a soft dough. The Alter Rebbe is saying the only reason why there's raw flour is because it's a hard dough.
You've seen how they make matzahs in Kfar Chabad, for example.
Yes.
You've seen the process?
Yeah, 1 second. Yeah.
There is no chance there is any speck of flour that was not mixed.
Here's a laboratory test. According to the author of this article, he says like this, that the argument has been made, before I address this, that the Alter Rebbe, who's saying that it's nira b'chush, that it's obvious that there's flour on the matzah. Anybody have a matzah, if you could see any flour?
No.
The reason why it's obvious is because people were making matzahs at home. They weren't baking in bakeries where the people doing the matzahs were professionals with a lot of experience. And therefore the argument has been made, and I think this is what Avi is trying to say, that nowadays, notwithstanding the fact that we have very thick, very hard dough and thin matzahs, nevertheless, because it's done professionally in these matzah bakeries and not every yokel doing it in their own kitchen, there is no concern. Now, according to the author of this article, he's not really saying his own thing, he's collecting from other articles. This is written by Rabbi Oberland, who's the chief rabbi of Budapest. He says that actually there were some laboratory tests done, and they found that there were some matzahs that had flour on them and some matzahs which did not. And it turned out that according to Rabbi Yirmiyah Katz is one of the biggest experts on mikvahs in the world today. He lives in Borough Park. He's written books on mikvahs, and he's extremely OCD and machmer and everything, but he's also extremely practical minded, and knows how to do all these things. So he was involved in this testing of the matzah. And according to his studies, what it depends is, according to him, it depends. The difference was whether the bakeries where the kneading of the dough was done with a metal stick. Those which had the metal stick, like they're doing for Chabad, to knead the dough, those didn't have any flour on them. But there are still till today many matzah bakeries, many matzah bakeries today that all the kneading is done by hand. And he says in those matzahs,
They also have more water in those matzahs.
They do?
Yeah.
Because it's done by hand,
Yeah.
right? Okay, I guess that makes sense. So anyway, so bottom line, even till today, there are still some of the matzahs that, according to the labs, have flour on them, and therefore there is actually a legitimate concern for shruya.
Yeah.
Others that don't, and like Avi said, nothing's changing. It's a Yom Tov of tradition. We do what we do, and nothing's changing.
Flour sticks
But
to a wood roller, you have to sand it off.
now, in the little bit of time remaining, I want to just address the question of the 18 minutes briefly.
You have 18 minutes.
A little more.
I think I'm going to do a little bit less than 18 minutes because I'm scared it might be overstaying my welcome. But in the spirit of keeping men out of the kitchen, I will quote for you a brisa about women making matzah.
Text me that so I can show my wife.
It's being recorded.
No, but it's actually obvious to anybody who opens Masechtas Pesachim that matzah, just like we started off saying how in those days matzah was no different than bread. It was just something you baked in your kitchen and that was it. It was also very obvious from learning Masechtas Pesachim that the norm was that the women baked the matzah, just like the women did all the other cooking in the house. Okay, so the brisa says like this. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, the first opinion, Rabbi Gamliel says, you could have three women kneading the dough together, and this is you have three women kneading the dough together, baking the matzahs in one oven, one after the other. So we're talking here about three women sharing an oven, which only has the capacity for one batch of dough, and we have three women sharing the oven. So what do you do? It says Rabbi Gamliel, each of the three women knead their dough, and then woman number one makes her dough into the loaf or however she thinks, puts it in the oven. That comes out, then woman number two takes her dough and does the same, and then woman number three follows suit. Chachamim say no, you can't just have the dough sit on the side over there. You have to, so what happens is woman number one kneads her dough. When she's finished kneading her dough, she starts being oirich the dough, which is, not rolling, but sort of getting it into shape or whatever. While she's doing that, woman number two starts kneading. Then woman number one puts her dough in the oven, woman number two starts kneading and starts preparing, and woman number three starts kneading, and that's how you do your, how do they call it, the line, yeah?
You have to stage it.
Right. Now, there are so there's machlokas in the Rishonim how to understand the pshat in this price. Of course, we pass like the Chachamim, like the second shitta, that you can't even to do. Now, there's basically two understandings in the Rishonim and what is the criteria that makes the bread chametz. One shitta is that in order for the bread to become chametz, well, let's go the other way around. In order for the bread not to become chametz, one needs to have that the dough is constantly being worked on. You can't let go of the dough, and as soon as you let go of the dough, I don't know if it's for a second or for 5 seconds but as soon as you let go of the dough, there is a concern that it may become chametz. B, even if the dough is constantly being worked, that will only save it from becoming chametz for the amount of time that it takes three women to do their thing with the bread, which, based on other Gemaras, we're going to, again, just going briefly, will suggest that is a hiluch mil, which is either 18 or 24 minutes. Right? So that's one opinion. In order to protect the dough from becoming chametz, you need to have a maximum of, let's call it a hiluch mil, let's call it 18 minutes, just for simplicity for right now. And also during those 18 minutes, the dough has to constantly be worked on.
In all areas of use by material and spiritual
I think in reality, they do the process is 13 minutes and they need 5 minutes for cleanup. Something like that.
No, that's not what I've seen.
No?
No. But in practice, we'll see in a moment. 1 second. The second opinion is, and this is how we pass in halacha, that actually it's one or the other. So it makes it a lot easier for us. That in order for the dough not to be chametz, you need to ensure one of two things: either that the dough is being constantly worked on, and that way you could just go, in the words of the Rambam, which I can't see right now, but even if it's the whole day, it's okay as long as you're working the whole day. And in fact, I actually mentioned this opinion before Pesach when we had the share about matzah that the Jews left Egypt with their dough and they baked it the next morning in Sukkot and it didn't become chametz. So how did it not become chametz over the time? So one of the answers is that they were constantly working the dough to prevent it from becoming chametz. I think the Chaim HaKadosh brings that opinion, right? Or, if you're not working the dough, then you have Kidei Hiluch Mil, which, again, for simplicity, we're just going to call it 18 minutes for now. Now, so because we pass in that way, there's no rush to make, like I said before, you could take all day baking matzahs. You don't need to do anything to rush it up more than that. However, we want to make sure that you do it quickly, so that the Ramah says, so that the shahiyah shouldn't add up to 18 minutes. In other words, you're constantly working with the dough, but there's breaks here and there. You know, you take the matzah from here, you pass it from one guy to the other. There's a few seconds break here and there. Those few seconds, after a number of hours, can add up to the 18 minutes. So therefore, slowly, these chumras started developing of doing things quickly, every couple of hours changing everything over, washing the dishes, etc., etc. The Ramah then also says that you should make sure that, say, the tools, the sticks, the knives, or whatever tools, your kitchen utensils you're using in the process of making of the matzah, you should constantly be wiping them off and make sure there's no crumbs on them, because those crumbs could get stuck and not being worked on, and it's quite easy for 18 minutes to catch up. And again, without getting into too much detail, as time went on, we started becoming more and more machmir and why the people, as generations come on, we do more chumras is really a subject for another class, and which chumras are ordained and appropriate and which chumras are, too much. And I think, again, it's a very important question, not for today, but so that's how the minhag developed. Now, there's still no mention whatsoever of what you're talking about, Avi, of cleaning up every 18 minutes. Now, practically speaking, in virtually all matzah bakeries today, what happens is that after 18 minutes, stop. The whole factory goes on pause, and everything is clean. The bowls are washed, and the tablecloth is changed if there is a tablecloth, or if there's no. I mean, they have some of them have a paper roll, and some of them have just metal surf, whatever, and they fiberglass or whatever, and it's scrubbed off and whatever it is. That is quite a recent development that they do that, and the reason for that is because it's not necessary. You have, the Alter Rebbe already mentions, I think, washing out the bowl in between each dough, or changing over bowls in between each dough, right? But there's no reason to stop everything every 18 minutes. Even if you, first of all, you could just, like the Ramah says, just keep on cleaning everything and making sure there's no crumbs right here while you're working. But even if you want to be machmir, like the shitta, which this is what it seems is the source for the chumrah today, is that we want to be machmir like the shitta, that even if you work the dough, it's going to become chametz after 18 minutes, right? You still don't need to stop the whole bakery every 18 minutes. What should happen is that every part of the process should be switched every 18 minutes. So the guy kneading the dough makes sure that he has new utensils every 18 minutes. In practice, he has new utensil every mayer, they call it, every dough, every batch. And then 18 minutes from when the matzah hit the table and they started working in it, you change the tablecloth. And 18 minutes after the first matzah got to the Yeah, so I'm trying to say all these words in English. the way they make the holes, So then you change that one. L'maisa, that's not the way it's done. And L'maisa, the way it's done is that they change everything every 18 minutes. And again, it seems to be done for the very far-fetched concern that perhaps there's a piece of dough or something from the very first batch of dough that got stuck over there, and we want to make sure that every 18 minutes everything is completely clean, and that remains the minhag today. I should mention though that even within the minhag today, there are difference. There is a difference, and this is something which you'll notice when you buy, which you should look at. This is the way the Rebbe designed the bakery in Crown Heights. And when does the 18-minute count start? Now, you could say that the 18-minute count should start when the matzah hits the table, because the guy kneading the dough anyway is washing his hands and changing bowl every batch. So the 18 minutes only needs to start from when the matzah hits the table. L'maisa, that's not the way it's done in many bakeries. And the way Chassidim for the past number of decades have always been machmir is to start the 18 minutes count from when the water touches the flour, and from the 18 minutes from then everything is paused, and anything that's not yet in the oven is okay. But there's a but some Sofer writes that talks about baking a matzah in 2 or 3 minutes. So it seems that the Chasam Sofer did it like the Zerkins, because unless you're doing one matzah at a time, you can't do it in 2 or 3 minutes.
By the matzah, can you tell how it was done?
So you have to do a little bit of research, and unfortunately, there is the person who's writing this article is actually very disturbed by this, that seems to be some dishonesty about it, because you would think that nowadays, if you buy a matzah with a good hechsher that says in there 18 minutes and you assume that it's 18 minutes from the lisha, from the thing. But apparently that's not the case. And therefore, in fact, this year I was very busy with this because the matzahs, I was in England and the matzahs that we usually get weren't available there. And I was trying to determine that whatever matzahs we did get back in England were going to be 18 minutes from the lisha. But so that is, that is. I mean, of course, all the matzahs are kosher Pesach, and chas v'shalom to suggest otherwise. But in terms of being machmir, that like the shitta that we want to be machmir. Hold on.
It has a Lubavitch hechsher on it. Can you assume it's
no?
Lisha?
No, unfortunately, the answer to that question is absolutely not.
Just get your life more complicated.
Yeah, seriously.
I go by the price.
Me too.
$14.99 beats everything.
That's the best hechsher.
Well,
On
the end
sale.
of Pesach, they were
Yeah,
selling
I buy it at $4.99 and
a
keep it for the next year.
The best thing is that if you overbuy it, Drew, you can just return it after Pesach and they
I
take
don't
it back.
do they?
Yeah, they do.
Oh,
Yeah, they did.
yeah.
Because
Okay,
they
I
were
mean-
running out.
They weren't. Not this year. They had lots.
No,
of
this
Don't worry,
year
they'll
they
sell it
didn't
to you
run
next
out.
year.
Yeah, I know they will. Yeah.
So which hechshers are good and which are not?
It's a lost cause. We'll just ask Rabbi Rapoport.
But see, the baking time, it doesn't take more than 2 minutes to do this.
No, it's like seconds. The actual baking time?
Yeah.
Yeah,
20 seconds.
yeah.
On each side. No.
Yeah, it's like
Well, it depends where. In the big matzah bakeries, it's 20 seconds. In this smaller ad hoc, thing bakeries,
Zirkin bakery.
it could be a minute or two. But it
I
doesn't
had the
matter.
Zirkin matzah, by the way. Delicious. It's definitely better than...
How much did he charge you for it?
He didn't charge me for it. His son, one of the sons of Shazak,
Yeah.
is married to my niece.
Oh, really?
So we had Seder together.
This year, no.
No, 3 years ago.
The one who lives here in Chicago.
In
There's 2 now.
Toronto.
Oh, Shazak has 2 sons in Chicago now.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Okay.
Anyway, so he brought his own matzah, and they look more like Hamantash than matzah. And it's like all kind of shapes. So I tried some. It's delicious. I told him next year I should buy from you guys. He's
What's
like,
the
"You
recipe?"
can't buy this stuff." Zirkin, man.
Closely guarded secret, right?
Yeah. He barely eats anything though.
Best matzah I ever had.
I don't know
Everything
if-
is homemade.
Mahmoud matzah.
Crazy.
I gotta tell you that even
Well, that's the Yemenite. It's Yemenite.
But it was their stink cracker,
Oh, yeah.
but it was delicious. It tastes like,
Yudas
tastes like a
Shemer-
biscuit.
Yudas Shemer's family name was my food. He changed it.
It's just so much easier to say.
Mahfoud, yeah, that's difficult. That was her name.
Delicious
I
matzah.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Best matzah ever had.
Yeah, so basically, just to summarize, the concern over here is that the dough, even though they change the bowl out every batch of dough,
Yeah.
on the paper tablecloth, for example, there could be a crumb from the first dough that
Change the paper.
Oh, yeah.
no, they don't. They only change the paper every 18 minutes. They don't change it in the middle
Oh,
of
not
the
every, you're right.
right? So basically, the chumrah that we have today, that we should have only 18 minutes from when the first batch of dough came in contact with the flour and the water, is to be choishish to that shitta, that even if the dough is worked the whole time, it could still become chametz in that amount of time.
But I do remember I worked